In the early 1760s, the fighting known as the French and Indian War ended, and Britain stood as the clear winner in North America. For many colonists, that result felt reassuring. They had lived for years with the fear of rival empires and frontier raids. Now the most powerful navy on earth backed them. They did not talk like a people trapped. They talked like British subjects who had been protected. That loyalty was not abstract. Colonists traded inside a vast empire that connected their ports to British markets and British credit. They relied on British soldiers and forts to steady the borderlands. They used British law courts, British governors, and the King's name on official papers. Complaints existed, but they sounded like family arguments, not a breakup. The basic assumption stayed simple. Being part of Britain brought security and opportunity, and for a moment it looked like the future pointed toward deeper imperial growth, not separation. Britain had gained new territory and now had to manage it, defend it, and pay for it. Colonists largely expected London to keep doing what it had done in wartime: spend money, send troops, and hold the line. Few imagined that the same victory that made the empire feel safer also created new pressure to tighten control. That tension waited just ahead. After the war, Britain faced a blunt problem: debt. Parliament looked across the Atlantic and decided the colonies should help pay for the empire that defended them. At first it came as trade rules and tighter customs enforcement, meant to raise money without changing daily life too much. But it did change things. Suddenly, officials watched ports more closely, paperwork mattered more, and politics felt less distant. Then Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It did not target a single port or one kind of importer. It reached into ordinary transactions. Printed items needed an official stamp: newspapers, legal forms, licenses, even playing cards. The message landed hard. This was not a tax that could be avoided by buying different goods. It followed people into courts, businesses, and public life, and it made the imperial government feel present everywhere. The reaction spread fast because the complaint sounded simple and shared. Parliament taxed the colonies directly, but colonists did not vote for Parliament. Loyal subjects now felt wronged as subjects. That shift mattered. Grumbling became organizing. Merchants, printers, lawyers, and crowds joined protests, pressured stamp distributors, and pushed assemblies to act together. A new kind of resistance formed, built less on local issues and more on a common argument against London's power. After the first shock of new taxes, resistance spread fast, but it did not move as one. Wealthy lawyers and prominent gentlemen wanted control because they feared chaos as much as they disliked Parliament. Merchants cared about profit and supply, so they pushed boycotts that hurt Britain but also threatened local business. Ordinary labourers and sailors pressed for stronger action, and they did not always wait for permission. Boycotts sounded simple, but they raised hard questions. Who decided which goods counted and how strictly people obeyed? Merchants demanded rules that kept trade alive, while activists demanded total sacrifice. Committees formed to organize purchases and punish violators, but even that created conflict. Some colonists saw these local enforcers as defenders of rights. Others saw them as self-appointed bosses, replacing one form of power with another. The split ran deeper than tactics. Many still wanted to fix the relationship with Britain, not break it, and they worried that street pressure looked like rebellion. Others argued that polite petitions already failed, and only economic pain forced change. Each colony argued inside itself, and colonies argued with each other, because their economies differed. Resistance grew, but it stayed uneven. contested, and far from a single American cause. In Boston, tension stopped being only about paper laws and trade rules. It turned physical. British soldiers had stood in the town as a reminder of imperial authority, and many residents treated them as an occupying force. Crowds confronted them again and again, and discipline cracked. In March 1770, that pressure ended in gunfire. Colonists lay dead in the street. After years of protest, politics finally drew blood. News of the killings spread fast and hit like a warning. If troops could shoot civilians, what else could the Empire do to enforce obedience? But the other question followed immediately. If crowds could harass soldiers until shots rang out, what else could street politics unleash? The event became known as the Boston Massacre, and the name itself pushed people to pick a side. It raised the cost of staying neutral. Moderates now faced a choice they had tried to avoid. Condemning the soldiers meant accusing the empire of tyranny and accepting that protest might escalate. Condemning the crowd meant admitting that resistance had turned reckless and that order mattered more than outrage. Either way, compromise looked weaker. The bloodshed did not unite the colonies. It forced them to argue about what kind of fight this was becoming and who was to blame. After the Boston Tea Party, Britain stopped treating Massachusetts like a troublesome province and started treating it like a warning to everyone else. Parliament passed a package of punishments called the Coercive Acts. The message stayed simple. Resistance brought consequences. Boston's port closed until the ruined tea got paid for. Commerce stalled. Jobs vanished, and suddenly the conflict stopped feeling like politics and started feeling like survival. These laws did not just target tea. They tightened royal control over local government and courts, and they backed that control with military power. To many colonists, it looked less like discipline and more like a test run for wider rule. Other colonies watched Boston get squeezed and wondered what happened if the same tools got used on them next. Sympathy grew, so did fear. Both emotions pushed people to choose sides. Some leaders treated Boston's punishment as an attack on all colonial rights, and they moved toward cooperation, sending supplies, renewing boycotts, and calling for joint action. But other colonists hesitated. They worried about disorder, lost trade, and the idea of rebellion itself. For them, London still represented stability, and radicals looked like the bigger danger. The Coercive Acts did not unite the colonies, they sorted them. By early 1775, arguments still filled meeting halls and newspapers, but many people clung to the hope that it stayed politics, not war. Local militia drilled, yet it often felt like insurance, not a plan. Then British commanders in Boston moved to seize military supplies and break the resistance leadership. That decision turned tense weeks into a countdown. The question stopped being what people believed. It became what happened next. In April, British troops marched out toward Lexington and Concord. They met militia, and shots were fired. Nobody controlled what came after. Fighting spread along the road back to Boston as more local men rushed in, shooting from behind walls and trees, turning a march into a running battle. By the time the soldiers returned, casualties lay on both sides. The Empire and its colonies had crossed a line. Armed conflict had started. Once blood had been spilled, neutrality shrank fast. Supporting the Crown now meant supporting troops who had fired on neighbours. Supporting resistance meant accepting armed rebellion, with all the risks that carried. Many colonists who disliked radicals still feared chaos more than London, but they also feared being treated as enemies by British authorities. Staying a colony stopped sounding like a stable default. It sounded like choosing a side in a war already underway. By 1776, the war dragged on, and the old hope of compromise weakened. The fighting forced a blunt question. If the colonies acted like a separate country, why not say so openly? Leaders in the Continental Congress moved from protest to separation step by step until they made it official. Independence stopped being a rumor or a threat. It became a public commitment with no easy way back. That commitment came with a document meant to lock the choice in place: the Declaration of Independence. It announced that the colonies no longer recognized the king's authority and claimed the right to stand among other nations, but it did not speak for everyone. Many colonists stayed loyal to the crown, either from belief, fear, or practical survival. For them, independence sounded like reckless revolt, not freedom. So 1776 did not settle the argument. It sharpened it. Declaring independence turned a messy civil conflict into a clear test of allegiance, and it forced ordinary people to pick sides in their own towns and families. Loyalists still expected Britain to restore order and protect them. Patriots now needed a new government, a new army, and new legitimacy. One choice split the population, and the consequences reached everywhere. After independence became official, the war did not suddenly swing in the rebels' favor. It dragged on, and the weaknesses piled up. The Continental Army lacked steady pay, supplies ran short, and enlistments expired. Some communities tired of sacrifice and questioned the whole project. British forces still held key cities and counted on loyal support. For the rebellion, the danger was simple. It could lose by running out of endurance before it won a battlefield. That was when the conflict stopped being only Britain versus its colonies. France entered the war, not out of sympathy, but out of rivalry. It saw a chance to hurt Britain and regain prestige after earlier defeats. French money helped keep the rebellion alive. French weapons filled gaps the colonists could not. And most of all, French sea power changed the math. For the first time, Britain had to fight a global opponent, not just put down an uprising and pine. Once France joined, Britain's attention and resources had to spread across oceans. Ships and soldiers that might have crushed the rebellion got pulled toward protecting the Caribbean, guarding trade, and facing French fleets. The rebels still struggled, and nothing became easy. But survival became realistic. Without France, the revolution risked becoming a slow collapse. More desertions, more shortages, more political drift back toward the crown. With France, the war turned into a contest Britain could not easily finish. By 1781, the war reached a breaking point at Yorktown in Virginia. British General Cornwallis became trapped, surrounded by American and French forces on land and cut off at sea. When he surrendered, it did not instantly end every fight, but it shattered Britain's will to keep paying for the war. The rebellion stopped looking like a gamble. It started looking like a victory. Peace arrived on paper in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. Britain recognized the United States as independent, and the new nation gained borders that stretched far beyond the Atlantic coast. It sounded like a clean ending. It was not. The war left debts, destroyed trade, and a government that had been built for emergency, not for peacetime. Independence came with responsibilities no colony ever carried. Almost immediately, the cracks showed. States argued over taxes, currencies, and who had to pay soldiers and lenders. British goods returned, but without the old rules, markets swung hard and people blamed leaders they barely trusted. Britain also kept forts in the West, and conflict over land did not pause just because a treaty existed. For many, stability had not arrived. It had been traded. In the present, the United States stood as a powerful, independent country, and it felt natural to many people that it had always been headed there. Independence looked inevitable in hindsight, but in the early 1760s, that certainty did not exist. Remaining British still seemed ordinary. For many colonists, it even seemed smart. The empire brought trade, protection, and status, and the idea of leaving it sounded risky, not heroic. That earlier world ran on belonging. Colonists used British law, British money, and British connections, and they expected Britain to fight their wars and defend their coasts. Their leaders argued inside a British political tradition, not outside it. Even when anger grew, many people aimed for repairs, not separation. They wanted a better place within the empire. That mattered because it meant independence required a hard break from what still felt familiar and legitimate. Even after independence, Britain still left fingerprints. American courts leaned on English common law. The language, the press, and political habits kept sounding British. Ideas like representative government and rights travelled through British arguments, even when Americans used them against Britain. So the question was not whether the colonies became something different. They did. The question was how close the outcome really came to the older normal option, staying British and building a future inside the empire.